Hey, welcome to another episode of Shane Plays Geek Talk. Thanks so much for listening. And this is actually, I didn't realize it before I sat down to do the show notes and get the episode ready to go out, but this is actually episode 250, 250. That's a nice number to hit, I think. So for all of you that have been on the ride since the beginning, thank you. For new listeners, thank you. Just really enjoy doing it. My favorite feedback to get is when somebody tells me that they didn't know about something until they heard about it on my show, but it interests them and they want to learn more, which is one of the reasons why I do a wide-ranging geek topic show instead of just camping out on one topic. I just have too many interests to do that. But I'm not down on podcasts that camp out on one topic. They do very well and they build an audience. And they serve a need, but that's never been what I've done with Shane Plays Geek Talk. So again, thanks for coming along. Today's episode, we've got gaming historian Jon Peterson back, playing at the world, the elusive shift, and now game wizards. And what we're going to be talking about today is Jon has worked through the details of the unhappy but absolutely fascinating drama of Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson, and TSR to bring us the facts of it all regarding the two most important personalities and the most important company in RPG history. This is about the not who created D&D, but the rise and fall of early TSR, I guess you could say, and the personalities involved. So we'll talk about the legal battles over royalties and ownership of Dungeons and Dragons and ownership of TSR itself. What is a game legally? The Eggbert Incident and its effect on TSR's financials. Inflated number reporting and lavish expenditures. Gary Gygax walks into the ambush at Sheridan Springs thinking he has all the bullets. But does he? Lorraine Williams' impact on financials by the numbers. Arneson's last day at TSR. What discovery surprised Jon during his research, and a whole lot more. So again, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to check out Shane Plays Geek Talk advertising partner, Cursova Magazine, CIRSOVA, Cursova Magazine. It's adventure fiction, it's pulp fiction, it's carrying that torch of the pulp sci-fi, fantasy, horror fiction that we know and love so much. So check out Cursova Magazine, CIRSOVA Magazine. And thanks again for tuning in to this episode of Shane Plays Geek Talk, and let's get ripping.
Shall we play a game?
Why, yes, I believe we shall.
Oh, I got a live one here.
Getting geeky in Little Rock, it's Shane Plays Geek Talk, a journey into the things we love. I'm your host, Shane Stacks. Thanks so much for joining. And Shane Plays is, it's not just when I play games. It's not just, video games or tabletop games or RPG games. It's also just when I geek out. Movies, comic books, TV shows, anything geeky. Well, if it falls under the geeky umbrella and I want to talk about it, it goes. But today we are talking about tabletop role-playing games, specifically the history of tabletop role-playing games. And joining me again, always a pleasure. So happy to have him join us again, is Jon Peterson, who people used to say Jon Peterson, author of Playing at the World, but he keeps adding to his bibliography. So, we'll kind of go over his books here in a second, but Jon Peterson is I would consider the scholar, the preeminent scholar of tabletop gaming. And he goes deep, but he also makes it very readable and accessible. So it's never dry, even when he's talking about dry things. But Jon, welcome back to Shane Plays Geek Talk.
Shane, it is always a pleasure. Thanks for having me back. And I'm not. You say I managed to make it enjoyable, even though it goes deep. It's still pretty dense.
Yeah. I have a note on that we're going to get into here in a little bit. But you make it readable, definitely. But yeah, you kind of made your mark, at least among the average gamer. Tabletop person with Playing at the World, your book Playing at the World. What year was that? 2012. So it's been out about 8-9 years now. And since then you've done Art and Arcana, the art history of TSR and Dungeons and Dragons, and I guess Wizards of the Coast as well. But that was along with Sam Witwer, Mike Witwer, and
Kyle Newman.
Yeah, Kyle Newman, who's also known as the director of Fanboys, among other things. And then you've done The Hero's Feast, which is a cookbook of recipes you might find in the Dungeons and Dragons world. And I think, who was it? That was you, Mike Witwer, and was Kyle Newman with you on that one? Who did?
Yeah, that was Kyle again. Sam, unfortunately, had a conflict. He would have worked on us with it, but he was super busy with Supergirl or something like that.
Yeah, he played a very good villain on a season of Supergirl. So it's always interesting because I've talked to Sam a couple of times here and there, and I've video chatted with him once. So it's always fun, when I see him on a show. It's always kind of a weird, like, you see the person and the character they're playing. But anyway, we're not here to talk about Sam. We're here to talk about you.
I could talk about Sam. We could do a whole show just talking about Sam. I love Sam.
Sam's a neat guy. Of course, he's the voice of Starkiller on the Force Awakens games, and he's Battlestar Galactica, and he's been in a bunch of stuff. So
he's Darth Maul in Clone Wars.
He's
right?
Right. Yeah, I completely forget to mention that. Yeah.
I mean, those last 4 episodes of Clone Wars, the ones were kind of like a movie, where he really gets to just pull out all the stops. Oh my God.
Really gets killing. I was glad they brought Darth Maul back because, one of my laments of the Force Awakens, or not the Phantom Menace, and I'm not as down on the prequels as a lot of people are. I'm sort of I know what it's like to be a sports fan and follow a team that has up and down. I just love Star Wars movies. But I was like, what a great character. He's dead. It was like, where did Darth Maul go? So in the animated universe, they brought him back and they did really cool stuff with him. And Sam, got to voice him. And then, like you said, or not like you said, I was going to say he's a legit street cred geek gamer.
Yes.
So legit. Like if you sit down and play with him, he's legit. So he's got the cred. He's got dice cred, man. He's got dice cred. Yeah. So anyway, so you did Hero's Feast, and then you've done The Elusive Shift, how role-playing games forge their identity, which we did a show on that not too long ago. And that book is right here on my desk. And then now you have Game Wizards, which is the sort of subheading, at least on Amazon, is the story of the arcane tabletop game that became a pop culture phenomenon and the long-running legal battle waged by its co-creators. So you've got a lot of your bibliography grows.
Does.
Yeah. So is there anything I forgot? Well, also you have the Playing at the World blog.
That's true.
Which has a lot of fascinating stuff. So is there anything else that I left out that you would want people to know about?
No, I mean, I write for some academic anthologies and things like that. And, you can find like rando articles by me on the web, but those are the things people are reading of mine. So, yeah. Okay.
Well, very good. I'm glad that I covered it all. And everything that you put out is fun. And some of it is more scholarly, like Playing at the World, I would say is a scholarly tome, even though it's very readable. And then stuff like The Hero's Feast is well done, but it's a little bit more just kind of fun, right?
Yeah, and I mean this is something where after we had done Art and Arcana, our publisher on that 10-Speed Press, which is part of Penguin Random House, they do a lot of cookbooks. They really came to us, right? And we're like, hey, we should do like a cookbook for D&D. And I said, that's something actually fun maybe to do.
Right. like what? I get to just have a little fun. And I'm pretty sure I saw when I was getting ready for this interview that Art and Arcana and Hero's Feast are both considered New York Times bestsellers, if I'm not kidding. At least one of them was.
Yeah, Hero's Feast is. Art and Arcana, they're kind of weird rules that govern what gets to be on the bestseller list for the New York Times that I don't completely understand, but Art and Arcana didn't qualify. I think we had the numbers, but I think it was viewed as like a promotional piece or something. Whereas Hero's Feast was treated as a cookbook, which is a separate category. So yeah, we spent a while on the New York Times bestseller list with that, actually.
That is so, and that's an ebook, but I also can't stress enough people go check out Art and Arcana. because not only is it a great coffee table book, whatever you want to call it, full of wonderful art, but there's some really good history and research in there. So cool. I mean, it's if you're into fantasy art, RPG art, or the history of D&D and TSR, I mean, it's going to hit you on one of those levels. So the last time we talked about the elusive shift, how role-playing games forge their identity, and how has that been received now that it's out there in the wild? Are you pleased with it? Have you gotten good feedback? Do people seem to be receptive to it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so it was definitely written, as a more academic book in many respects, even than Playing at the World is, right? I mean, Playing at the World, I was just starting out on this. I spent 5 years making it, and I kind of did every idiosyncratic, weird thing that I wanted to do.
Right.
From my perspective, it's just full of weird in-jokes and like tangents that I think are interesting. And when you work with MIT Press, as I did on Elusive Shift and Game Wizards both, there's a kind of a different expectation, right, about what it's going to be like. And so, I mean, to me, it's a pretty dry scholarly book, but I did my best to make it engaging and also something that I felt like would connect with more people than academics, right? It's
right.
Referencing conversations about what these games really mean, what we expect to get out of them when we play them, what we think role-playing entails, and how role-playing as a commercial label kind of shaped the practices that people engaged in once it came into play.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of fun to see people engage with it, which they're still doing. I was just listening yesterday to a podcast called Trying to Be Kind that is doing like a season about it. That they're kind of going through it like pretty much inch by inch, I guess. Which is, yeah, it's always gratifying when you see people kind of picking it up, and especially when you feel like they kind of get it, like what you're going for in it. And so in that sense, yeah, it's been great.
That's good. I mean, I just for someone like me, who I consider myself an armchair historian scholar, I mean, and I have a genuine interest in this stuff. It's like it's like, I'm so glad it's out there is all I can say. I'm so glad that you're putting these kind of books out, because so much of what you get of the history, and this will tie a little bit into Game Wizards when we talk about that here in a moment, but it's so much of it is anecdotal and arguments and debates between people, and to get, okay, here's the best scholarly research we can on what happened when, is invaluable in my opinion. So, and as I've said before, and so I'll say it again, to touch upon what you're doing, role-playing games are having a massive impact on pop culture and entertainment. So this stuff's going to be even more important decades down the line.
And certainly I agree. And I mean, I write for posterity, right? I mean,
Right.
I think I really do. I'm trying to capture, what might otherwise in some cases be lost entirely, right? I mean, if you go through Elusive Shift, Elusive Shift drops a whole bunch of super obscure sources, right? Like that, I mean, I know there are a couple of like museum or library collections that have some of these things, but it'd be hard to find a one-stop shop. And it's mostly just to try to answer questions of like who moved the ball for it. Like I think this is a game that, even though it might not be well known, had some innovative concepts, and it was certainly known when the market was so much smaller and so much more of a clique, right, of the people that were interested in this stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, the bibliographical dimension is really important to me, the archival work. I mean, basically, I just do archival-based history, right? Like, I work directly on primary sources and, like, try to just give an initial sort of it. And, what that process actually amounts to most of the time I'm working on this is, I look at 100 things and like one of them turns out to be relevant and I just write about the one, but it's really just being able to winnow out, okay, these 99 things maybe aren't what you need to look at to understand this, I think is useful when you're just kind of faced with the enormity of the material, enormousness, I should say, of the material that's out there.
Well, I think that, again, I think it's great and super important because, for probably at least 20 years, I had what I thought was the true history based on anecdotal information from people. So then I spread that. Oh, no. So here's how it happened, and and it inevitably involved the straight through line through chainmail and other things. And so the work you're doing is really important, because I help spread unintentionally either untruths or half truths, and they were well intentioned. I think the people that told me thought that it was the truth, right? But there was no record to go compare against. So again, very important. Speaking, we were talking about you mentioned the denseness of playing at the world earlier. So I had a note here to bring up. So I'm going to lead into that now and talking about the depth, the research you go to. So I've always, playing at the world, I've always used sort of as a reference. I'm going to kind of I'm going to go to this part and read, and then I'm going to go to this part and read, and then I'm going to look this up, and I'm going to look through the index. Oh, that looks neat. I've never just sat down and read it all the way through, right? So recently, a few weeks back, I said, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to read this thing all the way through. And it got apparent to me quickly how informationally dense playing at the world is. And I'm like, man, there's so much here. You'll cover in 2 or 3 pages what another book might cover in a chapter or a section. I mean, there's so much going on. And of course, you start with, you go back to the beginning, and you talk about war games and this and that and the other and work your way through. But there's so much there. But I'm doing it. I'm reading it all the way through, cover to cover. I'm doing it, man. I'm in the middle of it right now. It's
I don't envy you.
It's on my night table right now with a bookmark in it. So I've been enjoying it. It's really good. I'm reading all the footnotes. I'm reading everything. So and your footnotes are so good that the footnotes are like a director's commentary almost.
Footnotes are where I say things like, okay, I'm going with this date. I'm saying this happened in 1971. And then you read the footnote and it's like, so here's all the things you can read that contradict that. And like, this is why on balance, I think I'm going to go with 1971. Right. There's certainly a lot of that in Playing the World.
Yeah, no, the footnotes are definitely, I would say don't ignore the footnotes if you want the full picture. So, all right. So let's talk about Game Wizards, also known as the epic battle for Dungeons and Dragons. So, and the Joe, I'm going to try to say this right.
Manganello.
Joe Manganello has a blurb on the cover that says, John set straight the canon, in quotes, or in parentheses, no, not parentheses, in quotes, of the tragic history of how Dungeons and Dragons and TSR were ripped from the very grasp of the man who dreamed them up. So, and it's got, I want to camp out on this cover for a second. So, and I don't know if you had anything to do with the cover. A lot of times, the publisher will do the cover. Maybe you had input, I don't know, but I just want to kind of go through some of the elements here. So of course this says Game Wizards, the epic battle for Dungeons and Dragons, and there's a shadow of a dragon kind of in the background. And then you have 2 miniatures and like characters on miniature bases. And in between them, there's a D20. And the D20, first of all, I want to camp out on this. The D20, the facing is showing that it rolled a 0, which indicates to me that this is one of the older style D20s, which was basically a D10 that had the numbers repeated twice. Right?
You're correct.
So is that 0? Is that open to interpretation?
I mean, I think of it like they rolled a natural 20, but I think they did something. Those 2 miniatures represented there, and we can talk about the minis in a minute. They did something that did not have a high chance of success,
and they did,
and succeeded well beyond what anyone could have expected.
Okay, cool.
So just to get a bit into the history of these, so yes, I did have a bit to do with that picture. So I took that picture, those minis. And I commissioned those minis actually from someone a guy by the name of Jim Wampler, who does the great Marvin the Mage cartoons and so on. And I asked him to make me caricatures of Gary and Dave. And so that I wanted them to look like game pieces. There's a kind of a theme running through Game Wizards that people kind of treated this like a game at the time. Or rather, they thought of business as being this game that they should be able to play well because they're gamers. And so I kind of wanted caricature representations of them as miniatures for the cover.
And you've got one of them is holding sort of a staff and a clipboard, and the other one is holding a book, and trying to figure out what that. It's like a red sphere.
It has on it actually is a GK logo, which is the original logo of the Tactical Studies Rules Partnership.
See, so this is why I wanted to go.
Very tiny. The minis are that's actual size next to the die. So the picture was taken with the die next to those two minis. So, it's a little difficult to get the GK properly on the sphere at that small.
So he's holding sort of a red sphere with that logo on it. Is the one on the left, based on pictures I've seen at certain times in Gary's life, the one on the left looks like Gary Gygax to me.
Sure. Yeah, that's what you're supposed to come away with. Yep.
Okay, and then on the right is good old Dave Arneson. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff going in this cover. It's I probably spent more time looking at the cover recently than I did going through the description of the book, because I was pretty into that cover.
You don't have a book yet.
Well, I'm talking about the description of the book, like that's on Amazon and everywhere else, like going through the editorial reviews, and I read over all that stuff. But then I really lingered on the cover on the Amazon page for quite a while.
So I did put you on the list to get a copy. I hope that they send a copy to you if they haven't already.
Okay, I haven't received one yet, but I will definitely appreciate it.
You're on the list.
Okay, well, thank you, man. Here's the other funny thing that I noticed, other than the really clever cover, is you're currently the #1 bestseller in sports journalism.
Yes, I've heard that from a number of people.
So I guess sports journalism is the closest thing they have to games history.
Let me just put it this way, anecdotally. Like Art and Arcana, when it came out, was for eons the #1 bestseller in Warhammer games. I think it mentioned Warhammer on a page somewhere. That was literally how Amazon classified it. #1 bestseller in Warhammer games. So Bezos is just on another wavelength than the rest of us.
Well, you're now a sports journalist, John. You're an accomplished sports journalist, John.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Well, congratulations on being a #1 bestseller in pre-orders.
That's right.
And as of we're recording on October 10th, Sunday, October 10th, and the title releases on October 12th, so Tuesday, October 12th. It will be.
So, a lot of people have already seen it in the wild. People are tweeting at me about it. Somebody got one at Forbidden Planet in London already. Somebody, a friend of mine who was in the Hamptons in East Hampton today, saw it on a shelf in a bookstore in East Hampton and bought a copy there. So I think it's already out as far as I can tell.
Yeah, it's out. Yeah, it's in the wild. Well, I think it's close enough to the street date, right? That I guess it's not a problem. I don't know how all that stuff works. So, and of course, people can get it as a Kindle ebook if they so choose. So, but you're and I'm not. If people prefer Kindle books, that's fine. I'll buy some depending on stuff that I'm reading, what I'm reading. But for books like this, I want it on my shelf. I want to pull it off, use it as a reference book. Your books are in the category of I want to feel the weight of it in my hand, and I want to see it on my shelf.
Maybe I'm just old. I really like reading Kindle stuff now with the black background and white text. That's the main way I read. It's much easier for me to read if I have to sit down and read something long.
That's how you like to read something? Yeah. Well, I'm not against Kindle. I do a lot of reading on Kindle, but it's more of just pleasure fiction reading is usually what I use my Kindle for.
My eyes are shot after 15 years of looking at fanzines.
Yeah.
I think that is literally what caused the deterioration of my vision, is just the amount of time.
Dude, that can happen. I know a guy that's a pastor, and he spent so much time studying Greek and Hebrew on the original scrolls and things that he hurt his eyes. So, you could definitely do that. You're the second person I've heard of now that has done so much research and scholarly stuff that they've actually impacted their eyes, which shows how into this stuff you are. So
It could also just be natural degeneration that's merely correlated, not caused by my activities.
I'm going to go with a more sensational thing. Jon Peterson has studied so much that his eyeballs literally exploded. And
it's what I blame, because it's the amount I squint at those things, all the muscles that like control the lenses of my eyes have just long since checked out.
All right. So cover aside, the sports journalism aside, all that. Let's talk about Game Wizards. So there was a article you did, was it back in 2014?
Right.
Called the Ambush at Sheridan Springs. And in fact, when you announced Game Wizards, I was like, oh, I bet you that's more like Ambush at Sheridan Springs. And then at one point you mentioned, in some of your stuff, like, this is kind of, if you liked Ambush at Sheridan Springs, this is the book for you, kind of thing. So Ambush at Sheridan Springs tells the story of the day that Gary Gygax basically lost control of TSR.
Right.
And it's a really good article. And if I remember right, was it on Medium? I can't remember where at first.
Yeah. On Medium.
It was on Medium. There was also a post on Your Playing at the World blog that references it, but it goes into literally the what happened, like, in the meeting where Gary realized that he had lost control. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that article, that day? What kind of started us there?
Yeah, that fateful day, October 22nd, was it, of 1985. This was a moment when Gary had fairly recently retaken control of TSR. It was only just back in March that he became president again. And, it was not a good time for TSR. The company, had been radically downsizing. It had staff probably around a quarter of what it did just 2 years earlier. It had taken a bunch of losses, and, he was desperate to try to stabilize the company and steer it into a more productive direction. And basically what happened is he brought someone in who could help finance the company, this woman named Lorraine Williams, and basically put her in charge of operations. She was VP of administration under him, but she did most of the day-to-day business. Gary was much more kind of almost an exterior-facing chief executive at that point. And so, the story of that day of the ambush at Sheridan Springs is the day when it was revealed that, after Gary had taken control by exercising this 1976 stock option that gave him an additional 700 shares of TSR stock, bringing him up to around 1,371, I believe. It turns out his partner, Brian Bloom, also had one of those options. And he exercised all that, and based on his existing holdings and then some of Lorraine's shares, he sold this all to Lorraine, and that put her in de facto control of the company immediately.
Well, one thing I remember from that meeting, or from your description of the meeting, was that Gary is talking with some higher, I guess, executives. And at one point, he stopped and asked for an official count of shares because I guess he suspected something was up, or, he was trying to see what his footing was. And I think, if I remember right, he heard the count and he realized he was kind of in trouble.
Yeah, so he was and the book gets into this in more detail than the article did. He was kind of in a feud with the board at that point. And you can think about the board was made up of 6 people. There was Gary, who was chairman of the board then, and then Brian and Kevin, his original business partners, the Bloom family, who had been with the company since 76. But once the bank realized that TSR was just hemorrhaging money and that they were not taking the measures necessary to make this, to fix the situation, they insisted that they work with this industrial psychologist, this guy named Robert Thompson, who came in, and he recruited 3 independent directors. And these independent directors were people who didn't really work in the game industry, right? They were people who were just good at running companies, were experienced with the kinds of things that when a small company suddenly starts to make money, the sorts of mistakes they make, and how you might be able to get around that. And so, but Gary really had an adversarial relationship with especially the independent directors. And, he had been posturing about this, and actually he had threatened basically that he was going to use his control over the shares to reduce the board back to just 3 people. Something that would have outraged the bank if he'd done it. Like, there would be no possibility of him getting more money from the bank, but he was kind of posturing that. And so he went into this meeting and everybody knew it was going to be tense and that people were going to throw down. And he basically threatened to resign. And this resignation bid was over his royalty payments. People really felt his royalty payments were excessive, and that some of the agreements that he'd struck, probably the most pressing of them is the one for Oriental Adventures, where he was giving shares of his royalty to Zeb Cook, and there's like this whole thing he was doing, were against the company policy. And so he was like, look, I can just resign, and like, you people then will have to negotiate with me as a freelancer. You need my stuff. And so, like, why don't I just do that? And it's outrageous for someone who has controlling interest in the company to suggest that they're going to resign, but the remainder of the board was like, sure, go ahead. And that's when he started asking about the share count.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I knew there was a moment where he was like, wait a minute, and then he stopped, because it's like in the official minutes or something that he asked for the he said, what's the count of the shares? And I think that's the point where he realized that he no longer had a controlling interest, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because Brian had sold to Lorraine.
Well, he didn't know that Brian had sold to Lorraine. He just knew Brian had exercised the shares.
Oh, okay.
And that there were enough shares in play then that, potentially he would no longer have direct controlling interest in the company. And they actually hid from him that it was Lorraine behind this.
Okay.
And they managed to keep it a secret from him for some time, for like a couple weeks afterwards even. And it wasn't until they were about to have a shareholder meeting, which I think was supposed to be scheduled November 12th, that they had to post a list of who the shareholders were. And that was when Gary slapped everyone with an injunction and took them to court.
All right, so we've started in media res, as they say. I just wanted to use that to highlight, even though we're talking about, in some cases, the personalities and the financials of a company involved, there's still some pretty serious human drama going on here.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to highlight that so people wouldn't think that this is just some book about the spreadsheets of TSR. So let's back up. There's 2 people on the front of this book. There's Gary Gygax and there's Dave Arneson. Now, I have to say, anytime this comes up, there's and I'm going to liken it to sports fans again, like I talked about Star Wars earlier in sports fans. There are people that champion Gary, and there are people that champion Dave. My approach is, and I know what your approach is as well, because we've talked about this, and Mike Witwer as well. You don't have D&D without Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax.
Right.
So I'm not even interested anymore in having conversations about, did Gary or Dave create it? They both created it.
Yep.
Dave and the Blackmore bunch, Dave Arneson and his Blackmore bunch, the Twin Cities guys, they contributed a lot to what fantasy role-playing is and would become. And Gary Gygax contributed a lot, and also did a lot of business stuff that Dave probably wouldn't have done to get the game out. But they both contributed. They were friends. They worked together on games other than Dungeons and Dragons. So and so I want to clarify, and I think I know what the answer is, but I want to give you the chance to say, I mean, is this book Dave versus Gary, or like, what is this? If you had to sum up, what are people going to find when they read this book? What is this book about?
So it's certainly not about who invented D&D. That's for sure. It's not a book about how the system of D&D got assembled and like who did what, but it's definitely a book about how they got into business around D&D and what they thought that business was going to be like, and then what that business turned out to be like. So, right. I mean, I'd say that's maybe the main thrust of this. So it is for me a story of D&D as a product, right? And I think looking at it through this product lens, rather than worrying about who invented what, shows you an important component of the story that it's kind of too easy to lose if you get really fixated on, who invented role-playing games or something. There's a lot of argument about who invented role-playing games in the book, but, to me, that argument is just kind of part of this public relations situation that emerged after D&D became popular that no one really could have anticipated back at the time that the game was actually getting started. And so, a lot of it for me is just trying to provide that additional layer of context of like, okay, if Dave Arneson is concerned that he's not being paid sufficient royalties for D&D, that's not really a question about who invented hit points or experience points or anything. That's a question about a contract, right? And this contract contains certain stipulations. What actually were they? And when there was a lawsuit, what was the actual argument, right? Was this an argument of like Dave invented D&D? Of course not. It was an argument about how joint work is defined by copyright law, which is something that you understand by looking at things as their legal teams did, like the definitive treaties Nimmer on copyright, and look at what it means to have uncopyrightable ideas that get merged into a copyrighted work. And like, it's all of this like super technical legal stuff that was actually what was at stake in this battle. And that's kind of what I'm trying to expose, is that it's as technical as game system is, but it's not about game system. It's about, like contract interpretation and like and then kind of how they both positioned and spun this in the public discourse, which certainly it is a message of Game Wizards that all of the acrimony that you were referring to earlier among the people who are like Team Gary or Team Dave, like from my perspective, that stuff largely falls out of the way this conflict was spun. And so I want to show what the conflict was, how it started to get spun in real time as the conflict was happening, and then kind of what we got left with as a result of the ambiguities and the resolution of the conflict and kind of what people were and were not willing to say about it afterwards. So it's really not a book about who invented what, but it is a book about how people started arguing about who invented what.
So without giving away because you want people to read the book, you've put a lot of work into it, but in broad strokes, without giving away, again, all your hard work, what was the essential core of the conflict? Was it just I'm not getting paid my fair share, or was it because I've always kind of gotten the sense that Dave, they hired Dave in a TSR. And then after a year or two, or maybe even less, he was like, this isn't really for me. I want out. I'm not enjoying this, or maybe they didn't let him operate in the way he wanted to, and he wanted out, but maybe he still wanted to keep getting paid. But that's just my very hazy understanding. So what was the conflict?
Yeah, there's a couple of threads to unpack there that are kind of interesting. I mean, the first one about the circumstances of his departure, and this is a great way for me to talk about the limits of what I can do doing a book like this. Like I go into excruciating detail about Arneson's exit. I talk about what his last day in the office was like. I say where he went to lunch that day, where he went after lunch, like what the plans was he and Gary were sending to each other like during this day, what he told his friends afterwards. And like, even from all that, it's not super clear whether he was fired or whether he quit, to the point where when after he left TSR, and Dave went to try to get unemployment payments because he no longer had a job, there was actually an initial legal battle between Dave and TSR over whether he was fired or whether he quit. Because if you quit, you're not eligible for unemployment, right? But if you're fired, you are. And just watching the way they even spun that, of this whole question of, well, so effectively what happened is, in November of 76, October into November, there was a lot of tension, right, between Gary and Dave, and there was a boardroom confrontation, a shareholder meeting confrontation, that, kind of precipitated some of these events. But ultimately, Gary had a new employment agreement that he wanted Arneson to sign. And this employment agreement was very clear that, he wasn't allowed to be doing extracurricular work, right? He wasn't allowed to be doing work for companies outside of TSR. And, Dave didn't want to sign it. The long and the short of it was, by levying this agreement, on Dave and saying, if you don't sign this, then you've resigned. Is he being fired or not? And this is something that, again, courts had to, evaluate and argue over. There's depositions and letters just about this question of, well, what exactly was it that he did on the day that he left? And so even that just gets nitpicked to such a degree, I still can't tell you. I mean, I honestly don't even know if he got fired or if he quit. Maybe I lean a bit towards it was tantamount to a termination, right? This ultimatum that Gary made, and
I mean, before the lawyers get involved and come in with all, I mean, on the surface of it, sign this or you're out. Sounds like either sign this or you're fired to me. But even though you call it, you resign because they put a ultimatum on him. So I don't know, but
it's a little more complicated too by the fact that Arneson only wanted a 1-year contract, and that 1-year contract was about to expire at this point. And so, what his employment agreement actually looks like is so there's an immense amount of nuance around this. The point where the deeper you go into it, the harder it is to really say what happened. And that's something you'll see throughout Game Wizards. I mean, it's throwing up a ton of nuance, in part to make it clear kind of why both of their positions have been sustainable for so long, right? I mean, there was this fundamental ambiguity in their dealings where it's hard to say who was in the right or who was in the wrong in some of these things.
That's so interesting because it shows that even with contracts and legal agreements, there can still be ambiguity. Oh, we had a contract that said this. Yeah, but when you take this into account and that, so I guess the only thing that I've heard that seems to be consistent no matter which account I hear or read, and I'm desperately looking forward to reading yours because I know the level of research in it, is that Dave and Gary were unhappy with each other at this point. And I keep getting the feeling that Dave really kind of wanted to leave, but he didn't want to lose money. That's kind of the consistent two things I get over and over.
I think he did want to leave. I think he didn't like living in Lake Geneva. For a while, you read about this in the book, there was even a plan to have a TSR outpost in the Twin Cities where maybe Dave would live and work. And when that didn't look likely anymore, that made him angrier. And so, I mean, there were a whole bunch of factors that went into this. But, I mean, ultimately, Dave, by this point, wasn't spending a lot of time in the office. He would go home and work at his apartment most afternoons instead of staying in the office. And for a company this small that wasn't very stable yet, that was kind of controversial. So a whole bunch of factors that went into why there was this tension, right? But I mean, a big part of it too is that Dave just felt like his talents were being squandered, that he was spending his time working on shipping or editing other people's designs instead of doing what he thought would be the most productive work he could do for TSR. But again, you start peeling back that onion and the questions of why he had those assignments and what he would have been doing otherwise, they get super complicated every time.
So do you get the sense, I mean, is there any evidence that you found that really Gary just got him the job as a favor? Hey, you're a big part of D&D coming around, so I'm just going to try to do you a favor and get you this job? Or did he really want him there, contributing to game development?
Well, he did say something roughly to the effect of the former effect during one of their heated conversations, right? That really, anything I owed you, I made up for by getting you this job and letting you work here. But yeah, I think Gary's just angry at the time he said that, though, right? I think really he just needed bodies. And he wanted gamers to work there. He wanted this to be a company that was by gamers for. That's why he had Mike Carr, as the vice president. That's why he had Dave McGarry as a treasurer. It's not like he couldn't have found somebody that just knows how to run books. He wanted a gamer as the treasurer, and he wanted Sutherland as the artist. I mean, he went to all these Twin Cities people and assembled them and got them together there because that's the way he wanted the company to be. And it just didn't work out the way that he hoped it would.
So Apocalypse Now is an amazing movie. Okay.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen Hearts of Darkness, which is the documentary?
Sure. Yes.
That is it Coppola? His wife shot behind the scenes of all the human drama, which in its way is just as interesting and compelling as the movie. So I'm trying to stress that there is this what's going on here in Game Wizards, even though it's not quote unquote the history of who came up with the critical hit or whatever. It's just oozing with human drama. And everything that happened here in some way, whether large or small, rippled out and affected the hobby and the games we play.
It did. I mean, there's no question about that. And like the degree that this drama was something that the rest of the hobby industry, the people who wanted to either make war games or competing role-playing games, they all had a relationship with this drama that I think is another super interesting component of this story, just in the sense that, if you're a company, if you're a Flying Buffalo, if you're a Fantasy Games Unlimited that kind of lives in TSR's shadows, like the kind of figure that Arneson poses for you is a very attractive one, right? like as a symbol, Arneson's martyrdom was extremely helpful to TSR's competitors in the industry.
All right, so let me ask you some other things. I know that the kind of like ambush at Sheridan Springs stuff is in here. So does it cover, like, a lot of people say that advanced, and I'm sure this is an oversimplification, most of the stuff you hear anecdotally is AD&D was created just so they didn't have to pay royalties to Arneson. Does this book go into that?
Yeah, so it talks a lot about D&D and AD&D. I mean, I do think that's a bit of an oversimplification.
I agree.
The book makes fun of the claim that AD&D is a different game than D&D a lot. So, and I mean, it is kind of a bizarre position for TSR to have taken. But I mean, to me, the ways that the book mostly interfaces with this are through what is maybe the fundamental legal question that is in the book. And this is a question about the language of the original 1975 agreement, which is a copyright assignment, right, in a royalty agreement that Arneson and Gygax signed with TSR, where Arneson was supposed to be paid an amount for the game or game rules called Dungeons and Dragons. And, the contract's really short, and that it doesn't really provide much clarity on what people meant by the game or game rules called Dungeons and Dragons. And, the TSR's position once this became a legal battle, and to be clear, this legal battle actually started with the Holmes Basic set, way before D&D. AD&D was just like tacked on to the legal battle that had already started over Holmes Basic.
Okay, see, I don't think I realized that. So Holmes Basic was where the static started. Okay.
Yeah, and I can walk you through this. It's not too long a story. I mean, basically, when Holmes Basic came out, right, like it contained originally, there was a box, there was this D&D basic rules booklet, the blue booklet that was in it, right? There was some dice, there was the dungeon geomorphs, and there was the monster and treasure assortment. That's what the July 1977 Holmes Basic set contained. And when, they started paying royalties for the Holmes Basic set, they, instead of paying Arneson, his share of 10% of the cover price of the Holmes Basic set, they were only paying him 10% of the cover price of the blue booklet inside. So basically, which was then selling for $5. So like half of, say, what he got for sales of the OD&D, like OCE sets at the time, right? And like, TSR's argument was, well, look, this contract says we're supposed to pay you this for the game or game rules called Dungeons and Dragons. And that's what this blue booklet inside the Holmes Basic set is. The polyhedral dice are not the game or game rules called Dungeons and Dragons, and neither is the Dungeon Geomorphs or the Monster and Treasure assortment. And like, legal counsel even posed a counterfactual where they're like, well, look, imagine this. Imagine if we sold as a basic set. It's a box, it contains the blue booklet, and then it contains gold and silver miniatures that are worth $1,000. Like, is it your position that you're entitled to your share of the 10% of $1,005, right, for the, this entire theoretical set? Or are you only supposed to get it for the game or game rules inside it? Right. And like this whole question then of, you can see how this applies then to AD&D when it comes out. Like, what did they mean by the game or game rules that is Dungeons and Dragons? And, TSR's position was basically it applies to, the rules you originally published in 1974, of which the blue book inside the Holmes Basic set is an edit but it has nothing to do with, all this other product, right? And AD&D, the Player's Handbook, is not a copyrighted text that existed at the time you signed this 1975 contract, any more than you got royalties for, say, Greyhawk, right? The supplement. Even though that too is, it's about D&D, and it says Dungeons and Dragons on the cover, Arneson, you get royalties for that. Gygax and Kuntz did. So what made you eligible to get a contractual cut from books you didn't write that are not just kind of an edit of this original copyrighted work that was assigned to us in 75? That was the legal argument.
Which, I think that would tend to miff somebody off. It would miff me off, especially if you're selling a boxed game and in that box is my rules and other things. To me, that falls under the game or game rules, right? That one seems as clear cut as it gets. But again, you get lawyers involved and they'll have you think green is blue.
How much of the Holmes Basic Set's value is the dice, right? So they sold dice at the time for $250 or something, right? They'd been selling dice for that amount for years. And Arneson never got a cut of those dice before. What about packaging them with the D&D rulebook suddenly means Arneson gets a cut on the dice?
I guess because,
that was their argument.
You're right. In my counter argument, and I'm not a lawyer, and I don't even play one on TV, is that, you're packaging it together as a game. So you're saying these dice are part of the game that you're selling me.
Right. And as we all know, there was eventually a settlement, right, in 1981. And that settlement gave Arneson money for the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons books, right? So, ultimately, I think, his legal case was pretty good. It was pretty good on, it turned out, some fairly technical reasons. But, that notwithstanding, I think it was pretty clear to everyone that he would probably prevail based on the merits of the case.
Right. Okay, so let's shift over. And that was, like I said, I don't want you to give. I'd like to drill down even more on that, but I don't want to give you.
The book is out. I'm happy to talk about what's in the book. Okay. The book is out.
I want people to buy it. I want people to hear this podcast and be like, I gotta have this. But anyway, so one of the things that, again, I've heard or maybe read in passing in articles or whatever. So for a time, Gary Gygax went out to LA to try to develop the entertainment IP side of D&D, right? I think from what I understand, he actually lived there for a time. And I guess there was some success because they had the D&D cartoon done through, I guess, what would have been Marvel Studios at the time, or somehow association with Marvel. And then, so he was occasionally flying back to Lake Geneva. But there's this sort of belief or thought that while the cat's away, the mice will play. And he would come back and he's like, why does everyone suddenly have a company car? So he'd crack down on that. And so that some of the financial problems that TSR got into were evidently blamed on the fact that he was out in Los Angeles. And then eventually, for whatever reason, he came back and said, well, I'm going to try to get all this cleaned up or whatever. But I guess one of the reasons that they say that TSR was hemorrhaging money was because company cars and this and that and da-da-da-da. So did you find evidence of that kind of thing?
Game Wizards isn't super kind to the way that Gary later presented those incidents, to be honest. Look, this is a company that staffed up in 1982 during, we'll call it the year of the three presidents, right? A time when Gary, Brian, and Kevin basically were acting pretty autonomously and just putting whatever, because they thought they were going to be a company that was making $280 million a year in a couple of years, right? When in fact they were making $20 million a year at the time. But the business had started to plateau by that point. And they knew that sales of the core books were down. They knew sales of the basic set were down. And nonetheless, they spent really extravagantly. And almost all of the cost control problems that made TSR take a loss in 1983 and 1984 were just, they had too much headcount. Like that is by far the number one problem, is that they just had an excess of headcount. Their vehicle costs were a drop in the bucket of this. These are, they probably owned in 1983 300 and some $1,000s worth of cars. And it's true, right in the beginning of 1982, they had a company next door to them that was called Alpine Motors, that they actually ended up sharing some of their parking space at 281 Sheridan Springs before they moved over to 201 Sheridan Springs, to the big headquarters there, right?
Yep.
Like, they bought 15 cars from Alpine around the beginning of 1982. And like, yeah, everybody had a company car, but that did not happen like after Gary went to LA. Like, vehicle costs went down dramatically after Gary went to LA, because they were shedding employees. They were shedding company cars in the process. And like, this was not a case where there was rampant spending after they left. After he moved into the King Vidor Ranch in Beverly Hills for, by the way, a $10,000 a month rent.
Wow. Yeah.
Like, which was on TSR's tab. So if you want to talk about where cost was coming from, I wouldn't be pointing fingers if I were anybody.
Right. It wouldn't be, at a company car. Yeah. No, I've heard, and I don't know if, I've heard, oh, he's in a hot tub with models and movie stars. I don't know. I mean, who knows? But I will, the one thing I will say is, like, something came out of that, because the D&D cartoon did. And I know you did a really good, I can't remember if it was a blog post or maybe you did a video, or you did something where you talked about the movie scripts that Gary was involved with, that he was like, this is just like D&D. And it was like nothing like D&D. It's so strange. But anyway.
But again, like, if you look at that, they had to they spent a lot of money on that script, getting that script done, getting James Goldman, who had done The Lion in Winter, right, to like do this script. And like, they had to take a write-off for it. And you actually look at TSR's 1984 loss. TSR was about $750,000 in the hole. A big chunk of that is a $500,000 write-off they took related just to that movie script, saying nothing of the cost of the King Vidor Ranch and everything else.
Right.
Like, now, whenever you look at something like this, you can always say, well, if it hadn't been for this expense, we would have made a profit. And there's like all these other expenses you could point to in addition to that write-off of the movie script.
Right.
But, again, it's just one of these things where no one should be pointing fingers who was involved with this at the time.
Right. Let's just roll up our sleeves and fix this stuff. So, I want to point out on the Playing at the World blog, playingattheworld.blogspot.com, you've got a couple of posts up here that kind of give a little insight to the kind of things that you can get out of this book. You've got an early D&D development timeline. But I really like your TSR staffing post from September 29th, where it shows this, not only the amount of layoffs that happened, how quickly they staffed, and then how quickly they had to lay off, but also how they some of it they kind of announced, but some of it they kind of, they didn't really highlight the fact that they were laying all these people off. And it was quite a big headcount loss over a quick amount of time. And then I saw something, I don't think it's in this post, but I saw something recently while I was looking around that at one point, was it Inc. magazine? Somebody had TSR listed in the top 10, like, businesses, but it was based on misreported numbers.
Yeah, it was a little distorted. That they had them in the 10 fastest growing privately held companies based on their growth from 1976 up to 1980. And the misreporting is that, like, they kind of gave the 1981 numbers for 1980. And like, even that, so there's all this complication around how TSR does their financial years. If you're fascinated by nuances, like what happens when you have a 9-month abbreviated financial year, like for accounting purposes, like this is the book for you. If you're not fascinated by those, you're going to be encountering a lot of stuff like that I think is unfortunately absolutely necessary to understand how they ended up in the situation that they're in. Right. But yeah, it was a little misrepresented, but they were, on this just amazing growth path. And the problem is they just thought they were going to keep growing. They thought, they've been year after year doubling or even quadrupling in some cases. And then suddenly it stopped. And like they were growing like a company that, hiring people like a company that was expecting that they're going to be making 100 million next year and then 200 million after that. And like that just wasn't the way that this was going to play out.
So one of upper management's jobs is to accurately project, and they projected badly is basically what happened. I mean,
how would they know? Right? This is a completely new market. Like no one had ever had a business like this before that took off like that. I mean, it's unprecedented for like wargaming or hobby gaming. And like, so, there's no black swans. This is the only swan.
Right.
Like,
there's nothing.
They have no way to figure out precedent.
They have no idea if are we in a fad? Are we in a sustainable, business? What are we? They don't even know. So, which to the, they did try to expand in the entertainment. And so there's another post on your blog that kind of gives some insight to the kind of stuff you'll find in Game Wizards. It's called Game Wizards TSR Financials. That one's from September 16th. And I love this chart because you show a graph of their financials from 1975 to 1986. And there's a lot you can pull out of this. But it shows like, oh, here's when they settled with Arneson. Here's where they got into publishing with the Endless Quest. Here's where game revenue fell flat. Here's who the presidents were. All of this stuff. But one of the most fascinating things in here, and I'm sure nobody wants anybody to die or get lost or anything like that, but there's no doubt looking at this, like the Eggbert incident, you have it marked on here, September 1979. And that's where, it got glamorized into tunnels and trolls and all this other stuff. And it ended up being proven to not have really anything to do with Dungeons and Dragons. But that kid disappeared. And the story got out that he got lost playing Dungeons and Dragons, like in the steam tunnels or something like that. Right. It ended up being proved untrue, but once something gets into the news, people will run with it. And their sales went up like a rocket right after this Eggbert incident. So even though it was a bad thing that happened to Eggbert, it was a lot of free publicity for Dungeons and Dragons. And I mean, I don't see how you can argue that the Eggbert incident didn't somehow contribute to their dramatic increase in sales.
Oh, yeah. No, so I talk about this a lot in the book, but honestly, I think this is one of the things that will surprise people least. I try to go into real kind of blow by blow, and there's some cool stuff that I have in there. Like I found this piece that Rose Estes wrote right after it because she was doing PR for TSR at the time that I found super insightful, just at kind of the blow to blow of how this felt at TSR when it was happening. But I think this is conventional wisdom, and I like writing things where I don't have to disagree with conventional wisdom. It's hassle when I have to like differ with what everybody already believes. There's no question that that sales growth that you see following that is attributable entirely to the fact that this is on the front page of newspapers throughout the country. Often, this private investigator, William Deere, the guy who was trying to find Eggbert, he'd be holding the basic set. And, you've got like pictures of this guy holding a basic set that, this would have been inaccessible given TSR's size and budget to them to get that kind of publicity. And as soon as people started to think, oh, this game might be dangerous, that is your surest sign that a bunch of teenagers are going to want to play it.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I didn't play D&D because it's dangerous, but it definitely was part of the mystique, right? There was a mystique in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s, even to D&D because of the satanic panic and because of the Eggbert and all that stuff. It was part of the mystique. I have to admit it. It gave it a little extra. What do they call it? A frisson? I don't know how you say it. Yeah, it gave it a little extra of that. So there's something else in this chart that I think is very important to point out. And people who are good at business and come in and reorganize things and try to get stuff to profitability often, get seen as the villain. But there is a revenue versus profit chart, or a revenue versus profit lines on this graph on that TSR Financials blog post I'm talking about. And the highest profit, even though they were making revenue like crazy, profit didn't really start dramatically going up until Lorraine Williams took over. Now, I don't know how long that continued past 1986, but just from a pure business standpoint, it looks to me like Lorraine Williams was good for TSR.
I mean, you gotta take these things a bit in perspective. So, I mean, it was pretty close to the 1982 number, right? If you have the chart in front of you, like, 1.8 million in profit versus it's a little less than 2 million. It's like 1.97 or something for 1986 after Lorraine took over. But I mean, the key thing to get is that by the time Gary exercised his stock option and took over TSR in March of 1985, the company had 95 employees, down from nearly 400.
Right.
In other words, like overhead had reached a point where you could make a profit from this business again. Now, the only reason they didn't make that profit in 85 is because they owed a tremendous amount of money to unsecured creditors. They had a bunch of severance events they had to deal with. So they took this enormous, what we call an accounting charge, right, in 1985, which is why you see that real trough of like 3.8 million loss in 1985, which is awful. It was so bad they had to suppress it. Like they wouldn't let their like audited financials out because they would have lost their terms with distributors and their other creditors and everything else. And so, but I mean, once they had cleared all that's kind of sweeping the trash out the door. Suddenly then you have a lean company with a product that people buy that, is not going to be pushing out as much product. So the potential for profit isn't as high, or the potential for revenue isn't as high, but the potential for profit was enormous. And so Lorraine, I mean, she made her move at the right time, in other words.
I got you.
Like the time she took over the company was a time when it was poised for a rebound. There's no reason that company shouldn't have been making the amount of profit they were in 1982, right? Other than the fact that they just completely overextended and like had way too many people working for them, and they're just in way too many like unprofitable side ventures that they were trying that, the Greenfield Needle women, they tried to do video games and it didn't work. They tried to do miniatures and it didn't work. They tried to do Hollywood and it didn't work. So, I mean, there were just all of these things that weighed them down in that 1982 to 84 period. But those were all gone by the time Lorraine took over in the fall of 1985. And so, of course, the company was poised for success at that point.
So she got to ride that wave. All right. So now I noticed that in your blog post anyway, your TSR financials goes from 75 to 86, and then the TSR staffing goes from 76 to 85. Is that roughly the period you cover in Game Wizards?
I mean, there's an introductory bit. It's in 4 parts. So the first part is really about, it's up to the death of Don Kay when Gary had to take over TSR and be president, which was never the plan, right?
That was a blow to Gary on a deeply personal level, because they were, that was his good friend. So that was a blow on a personal and a business level.
They were the same age. I mean, just imagine what you would think about that, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so there is a part that leads up to that, and that part is mostly me just geeking out on how little money, like the things like Guiding Games, Chainmail and Don't Give Up the Ship and things like that make. These are times Gary is making $375 a year. That's his 1971 number from when Chainmail and Tractix and all those things came out. Like, this was not something anybody imagined could make any money. And really, so the first chapter is really just first part is intended to get you up to when Gary then has to take over the company in 75.
Gotcha. So at what point, like, what year or years? I know at one point he was like a cobbler, doing some cobbler work or something.
I talk about that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and at another time he was working as in an insurance office or something, and so because I think didn't he get yelled at or scolded for mimeographing some of his game stuff on the. I can't remember. It's a hazy half memory, but.
I think it'd be safe to say yes to that. Yeah.
And then,
he was definitely using company time and company resources to publish these little things like the Domesday book, that like nobody should care about.
What else would you like people to know about this book?
I mean, I think I think people have a good sense of what I'm trying to say and where I think, things are clear and where I think they're unclear. And there's a lot of places I think they're unclear, but I mean, I guess one more thing I'd say it does, it really tries to show TSR in the broader context of the industry. So it talks a lot about, for example, Gen Con versus Origins and the battles between the conventions and kind of how people in the industry tried to position wargaming against role-playing games and how much money they were making versus, say, what Avalon Hill or SPI was making. We go into the whole drama of when TSR acquired SPI and like the awful fallout of that. So it isn't insular to TSR and to these players. It's very much trying to give enough of the context of the industry to make it clear how unique what TSR was doing really was.
Right. And to kind of tee off on that, just to go back to playing at the World, I'm reading through that when I read through the war game stuff, like the different types of war games. So just calling yourself a war gamer didn't cover it. Because this is a board game with chits on it. Well, this is a table over here with sand on it. It was a whole different. So you couldn't even lump war gamers together. Not really. It's just fascinating. Yeah, and the absolute importance. We talked last time of the elusive shift of the absolute importance of these zines. But but when you look at wargaming and the early, especially wargaming. But I'm assuming the early RPG stuff too, these sections that these magazines devoted to finding opponents. So important. And then I love all these like mob type groups that had all these overinflated claims of how many games and stuff they won. Dude, it's amazing. The human stories behind all this stuff just never fails to entertain and amuse me. So you might have like one kid in a basement somewhere presenting himself as like this mob of like, 20 war gamers that never loses a game and all. It's so crazy.
Is it any different than what you get like, logging into any Overwatch or
no, not a lick. No. It's not any different, which in some ways is reassuring, right? Human nature is human nature.
I'm not sure. We don't see much progress that way.
Okay. Well, that too. I'm just saying, like, you're like, oh, the behavior is so terrible these days. It's like, well, it was, it really hadn't gotten much worse. That's how it was back then. But you just had people boasting in game industry magazines. So anyway, well, I can't wait to read this book. Like I said, this is, I love all this stuff. I have to say that I've never been happy about the fact that Dave and Gary fell out. And I've never been happy about the fact that Gary and TSR fell out. But I am fascinated by everything that happened. Right. So I'm absolutely ready to read your scholarly researched approach to get the most accurate picture that we can get of what did happen.
It's the best picture I can make anyway from the stuff I've seen is the way that I put it. And like, I still believe the study of the stuff is in its infancy, right?
Yeah.
And like this is my best swag from what I can figure out. And, I certainly am not doing this with any, I'm certainly not on anyone's side in this.
Right. You're on the side of the truth.
I don't know if I'd put it that way. I think I'm just trying to have enough ironic distance from everyone because, the business story, it's a train wreck, right? This is not a happy story. Don't read this uplifting story. Like Playing at the World is an uplifting story about like the amazing design concepts and what people made of them. And like, it's awesome. This business story is not that. This is a train wreck.
Right. Yeah. Which is sad. Well, would you be fair to say that you're on the side of the facts that are available?
Yeah, I'm trying anyway.
So speaking of that, as you research this, was there something that you discovered that surprised you?
Yeah, I was surprised by how much money Dave Arneson was making from royalties before the settlement.
Oh, that would surprise. Yeah, I'm interested in that because I've always just assumed he was getting a pittance.
Yeah, he was making what's the equivalent of around $500,000 a year in today's money, just from the royalties on the basic set and the OCE.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, that still doesn't change the fact that if he felt that he was getting done wrong, that he should go to court. but that's much more than I would have. That's much more than I would have guessed.
Yeah, me too.
I suspected he was getting, oh, we're paying him royalties, and it was like, $1,000 a year or something, or probably more than that, but nothing on the level of you're talking about.
Yeah, it peaked right before the settlement. I think at like 132,000, which again, adjusted for inflation, is like 450 or so in our dollars. So pretty significant, actually. That surprised me.
Now, did he keep getting royalties, or when did his royalties end, or did they? I mean, I like TSR sold to. I'm trying to remember what year that Dave Arneson passed away, and matched.
2009.
Okay, so that was well after TSR sold to Wizards of the Coast. Did his royalties and stuff keep up after that?
Just speaking at a very high level about Wizards' business practices, which I generally avoid talking about, my understanding is that Peter Atkinson had an agreement with both Gary and Dave after he acquired TSR that effectively supplanted any previous agreements and gave them money for any and all work that they had done, right, like on those games previously. But I have no special insight into what that's about.
Okay, I was just curious. Yeah, so I'm not here to. I think it's more comfortable probably to talk about businesses that have gone rather than talk about current businesses. So yeah. Well, anyway, that's interesting. Okay, well, I'm glad I asked you if there's anything that surprises you, because that surprises me. All right, folks, it's Game Wizards. That's the book. You need to get it. Even though it doesn't release for 2 more days, it's already in the wild, because that's how strong and amazing this book is. It broke loose the bonds.
Sports journalism fans everywhere to buy Game Wizards.
See all these, like that classic sort of, the sports journalist. Like I always think of, was it Walter Matthau from The Odd Couple? He was like a sports. I think of that, the hat and the white T-shirt. I expect
to be on with Bob Costas next week.
I get to see all these sports journalists reading your book. That's great. So it's Game Wizards, the epic battle for Dungeons and Dragons. So check it out. As always, I love having Jon Peterson as my guest, and check out his other books too. This stuff is really, really interesting. All right, I got to do it to you, Jon. It has to happen. I got to give you the bad joke of the week.
All right.
Or the bad joke of, I'm not quite weekly anymore. I'm a few times a month. But all right, here we go. You ready? Have you limbered up? You limbered up? Okay.
Yeah.
What kind of noise does a witch's vehicle make?
Broom.
Yep. Broom, broom. You got
easy
it.
One.
Oh,
was an easy one.
Was that easy? Okay. But was it bad? That's the important thing.
It's appalling. I really don't understand why you do this to yourself.
My therapist doesn't either. My therapist is appalled and horrified and can't get me to change my compulsive behavior. So I keep going to this therapist thing because I've been binging The Sopranos lately.
A lot of people have been. I've heard that show's having a resurgence right now, actually.
Well, what happened is that a couple of weeks ago, like was it last week, the week before, the mini Saints of Newark dropped.
Right.
And that dropped on HBO Max, which is a prequel movie to The Sopranos.
Explain it.
Yeah, and so I'm like, I've been binging The Sopranos since then. So I've got all this, and every episode has scenes where he's talking to his therapist. So that show really holds up. I don't know if you ever were a fan the first time around, but
I was. Yeah, I mean, there was nothing like it when it was out. I couldn't believe it.
It holds up really well. It doesn't feel dated really at all. Probably about the only thing dated about it is they're not using cell phones.
It's just that there's so much new content now. I mean, there's so much great. I'm watching Squid Game at the moment, so
I can't. Everybody's talking about Squid Game. I've got to check this out. So it's, but I'm hearing that there's something about the English dub that people don't like. I don't know what people.
I'm watching the sub, the Korean with.
Yeah, that's probably what I'll do. So, all right. Yeah, I hear good things about Squid Game. Sort of like Battle Royale, kind of Hunger Games kind of stuff going on or something. I don't know.
It is, but with a bit of Parasite, if you saw that movie, kind of jammed through it. So.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm going to check it out. Parasite won the Oscar, didn't it?
It did. Yeah, it's an amazing
Yeah, amazing movie. All right. Well, cool, man. Well, as always, thank you again. Always a pleasure to have you. I'm already looking forward to whatever your next book is, whatever it is.
Yeah, there's more coming. I hate to say it because it's just too much these days, but there's more coming. But seriously, thank you for having me on again. It's really a pleasure. Always happy to come back and talk to you, sir.
Yeah, man, I love it. Thank you so much. So can you tease us at all what any of your future projects might be? If you can't, that's fine. But
I don't think so. Yeah. I think it's contractually forbidden from teasing.
So it's not the book covering the RPGs they're playing on the International Space Station.
It is not. That would be a short book.
You never know.
I don't write short books.
They could be up there playing. They could be up there using Roll20. You never know. We saw the ISS go over the other day, by the way.
Oh, did you?
I've got this little tracker app on my phone now that it tells you when it's coming. It shows you exactly in the sky where to look and how long it's going to be visible. So me and my wife and my son went out and watched I called it the International Space Speck, because it's literally just a little speck going across the sky, but it was pretty neat. So, all right. Hey, man, let me let you go. Thank you so much. Really looking forward to reading this book. And everybody else, thanks so much for listening to Shane Plays Geek Talk, and we will catch you next time. Thanks so much for listening to Shane Plays Geek Talk. I certainly hope you enjoyed this journey into the things we love. For your convenience, show notes with helpful links for each episode can always be found at shaneplays.com. You can catch the podcast in several places, including on the blog at shaneplays.com, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Verbal, YouTube, and more. Shane Plays is also carried on sci-fi.radio. Sci-fi.radio is sci-fi for your Wi-Fi. SCIFI.radio. If you like what you hear and would like to support Shane Plays Geek Talk, you can do so for as little as $1 per episode on Patreon at patreon.com/ShanePlays. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. Stay geeky, my friends.